Today we're going to make a loaf of basic bread. Bread fascinates me as a food product because it has such a long tradition. If you can imagine, 10,000 years ago, people discovering that somehow you could make this substance from 4 different separate ingredients, you mix them together and you make this dough that is silky and soft. And then if you set it aside for an hour or two, it will actually grow and become fluffy and warm and nutritious. So the fact that you can take these separate ingredients and turn them into something not only nutritious but also portable and amazingly tasty. So for a long time, bread has had a central place in European cooking. And in fact, it was referred to in the past as the staff of life, the thing that supports human life. That's quite a claim for any food. What we find today, though, is that rather than being the hero, bread has become a villain. There's a misconception that gluten, which some people are intolerant to, there's this belief that gluten is unhealthy and that we should avoid too many carbohydrates. Part of this has come about because we no longer make bread using really good quality ingredients in a handmade, slow tradition. So instead of getting bread that's fermented slowly and that has lots of nutrients available, what we're seeing is bread that's made in factories with chemicals added to speed up the process, made with low quality flour, and it simply doesn't have the nutrients that make it great. So what I'd like to suggest is if you can learn to make bread at home and you use good quality ingredients, then you can produce something that will nurture and sustain you, that you can share with friends and that you can get better at over time. And there's a real pride in doing something with your hands. So if you watch these instructions and then follow along later on, once you've seen them once through, hopefully you'll be able to create your own loaf of bread over the next few hours. So, all right, let's get started. In this bowl, I have 500 grams of strong white bread flour. It's called strong flour because it's high in protein. That means it's a good quality flour. You can buy this from a supermarket in small 1.5 kilo bags like this, about 50 or 60 Hong Kong dollars. Or if you get a bit more serious, you can get 25 kilo bags like this one. This was about $420, which makes it much cheaper. So I've got my 500 grams of plain flour here. In addition to that, I'm going to use some water so that I can mix it, and I'm going to put some yeast into the water. So let's start by doing that. In the yeast goes. It's best if you try and sprinkle it in or pitch it in rather than dumping it in. So the quantity of water varies depending on the temperature and the humidity in the atmosphere and how much water is already in your flour in terms of moisture. A basic recipe would be 300 milliliters of water to 500 grams of flour. I've used a little bit more today because it's winter time here and it's dry. If you use too little, you'll find that you can't knead the bread to bring out the gluten, which we'll talk about in a minute. If you use too much, it starts to stick everywhere. So a careful balance there. In terms of the yeast, that is instant yeast. You can use sourdough if you like, but that's a slightly more complex story. Instant yeast works quickly. You can buy it in the supermarket, and I've used 7 grams there, roughly. To my flour, I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of salt. Depends on how much you like salt, how salty you want your bread to be. I'm probably going to use slightly under a tablespoon there today. In that goes. All right. I'm going to mix that up. It doesn't have to be too thorough because I am going to need it, but it's nice to get the salt mixed around before we get the liquids in there. So that's 4 ingredients so far, and that's enough for any kind of bread. I'm going to add some oil. It changes the texture of the bread slightly and acts like a preservative. You can use any kind of oil. I'm going to use olive oil. It's just tasty and healthy. And I don't really measure the olive oil out. I just put a glug in like that. All right. The other thing you'll see that I've got over here is some flour just in a container. You'll see that sometimes I sprinkle that on the counter and I use it to dust my hands in order to stop the bread sticking, depending on the kind of bread I make and the temperature of the bread. All right, so I now have my salt, my flour, and my oil all in the bowl. I've made a well in the middle, so it's kind of a space for the liquid to go in so that it doesn't all stick the flour to the edge of the bowl. And I'm now just going to pour this in. I try and go slowly to start with, and then fast at the end in order to get all of the yeast out. Brilliant. Okay, with my mixing spoon, I'm going to start by going around the edge, trying to keep all the flour in the bowl. I'm trying to fold the flour into the water. This will seem really weird to start with. It's like the flour is floating on the water, and you think, I'm never going to be able to touch this. I'm never going to be able to knead it. And this is where bread making starts to get sometimes a little bit worrying. Have I got the right ingredients? Have I got them in the right amount? It's kind of liquidy, but slowly as you fold it around, the liquid ends up in the flour. Try to get the flour off from the edges of the bowl as you mix it around. And slowly you'll start to see something that looks a bit like a bready dough. In a moment we're going to tip this out onto the counter. Some bakers, I think more traditional bakers from what I understand, prefer a wooden bench. Here I happen to have a marble bench, but really any clean, non-porous surface should do. Alright, so I've got this into some kind of shape. There's not much stuck to the edge of the bowl. I'm going to tip it carefully out onto the counter. I'm going to scrape down my spoon just so that I don't waste any. You can see it's starting to stick to my fingers a little bit, which feels a bit weird when you start. You think, oh, that's not right. But what you'll see is that as I knead it, it starts to clean my hands up. I'm going to put this bowl on to rinse for a minute. By filling the bowl with water, it ensures that the flour that's in there doesn't stick, so when I go to give it a final clean in a minute, it should all come up nicely, and I'm going to use that bowl again in a minute to store my flour, my dough when it's done. So this isn't quite dough yet, but it's on its way. What we need to do to turn it into dough is to compress all the materials together and to stretch them out. And when we stretch them out, the water and the flour mix together, and two different proteins in the flour start to form elastic webs, and that's the gluten, and it's the webs that you see stretching out, and the more you stretch them, the more you make. And it's the webs inside the bread that are going to trap the air, because the yeast is going to want to eat the flour to get into the sugar, and as they do that, they release some gas. Let's not call it farts, but yeah, it's kind of like a fart. They release the gas, and you don't want the gas to escape through the flour, you want it to be trapped in your gluten pockets, and that's what's then going to make the bread rise and become bready later on. So my hands are now clean. Hopefully by the time I finish, they're pretty clean as well. I'm going to start pushing this down and folding it in. You'll see some bits are more floury, some are less. Some bits will stick to the counter, some bits will stick to my hands. That's okay. And then I'm going to use this method of two hands with my fingers at the back of the bread and my heel and my palm at the front. I'm going to pull out and then I'm going to draw back. And I'm going to keep doing this, trying to keep the counter clean, trying to keep my hands clean, although it's hard to start with. I may even have used a little bit too much water today, so if you find yourself in this position where it's really sticky, you can add a little bit of flour to your hands and that'll help. But as you know from experience, this will soon become a lot less sticky. And I don't want to over flour it at this point because I want a nice dough. All right, I'm just going to keep doing this. I'll probably stop talking here for a little bit. It's quite hard work as you move this around, if you do it fast and intense. So you hear my breathing get a bit heavy as well. Every so often I'll just clean up the counter, pick up any stray pieces. Every time I put the bread down, I try and turn it 90 degrees so that it's being stretched in all different directions. see it's going from being just separate ingredients that have been mixed together. It's now really starting to stick together, and every time I stretch it out, you'll see these strands, these webs in here. That's all the gluten. Better flour makes more gluten, more kneading makes more gluten. As you do this, the texture of the dough will start to change in your hands. And particularly, if you stop and feel the surface, you'll notice that the surface becomes smoother and more silky. And that's how we know when we're done. It's really smooth. You don't have to knead this fast. But I have to make a lot of bread in one go, so I don't want to be here all day. Sometimes you can just roll it around in your hands like this, just picking up any stray bits. You'll see my hands are a little bit dirty, but a little bit messy. Alright, let's take a look at the dough here. Surface is nice and smooth. It's not too sticky to the touch, so it's not too wet. It's a little on the wet side. If you were here making bread with me, I'd definitely get you to start with a little bit less water. So instead of 310 like I put in, you might go just with the straight 300. You'll start to see now when I pull it out how thin it is in the middle. That's a sign that your dough is getting better. Getting more gluteny, more elastic, more bready. So I've been baking for about 2.5 years. I've read a couple different books, particularly the River Cottage Bread Handbook. It's particularly good, I found. But mostly I just try and practice. I make bread once or twice every week. Just try and experiment and see what works and what doesn't work. And eventually you go from making nice, tasty bread that's okay to creating some bread that really looks good and tastes good and has a good crunchy crust to it. But like all things, just takes a lot of practice. Alright, you can see now this is nice and smooth. It's a little bit on the sticky side, but that's okay. Alright, I'm going to prepare it to go into the bowl. So I'm going to sprinkle a little flour over it, put a little bit in my hands. And then I'm just going to flatten the dough out like this. Flip it over, and this bit involves a little bit of technique. So I'm going to take the dough at the top here, I'm going to pull it a little bit, not squeeze it too hard. I'm going to fold it into the middle, and then just where it meets over here, I'm going to do the same again, and then again. And I'll probably do this 6, 7 or 8 times. It starts to look like a char siu bao dumpling. I can now flip it over. And what I want to do now, instead of squeezing it inwards with my hands like this, I'm actually going to try and roll my hands flat underneath. I might occasionally just squash it and pat it, but mostly I want to flat hand it around. And what you'll see at the top is that these lines of stretched gluten start to appear. This means that in the next phase, the air that's being released by the yeast, who are starting to wake up and feed, is going to be caught. Okay, with that nice and tight, I'm going to prepare a bowl to store it in, and then we'll talk about what's going to happen next. to use the same bowl because then there's less tidying up to do and you end up at the end of the process just spending less time cleaning up. Right. So what's going to happen now is something called fermentation. The yeast are going to eat the sugars that they get from inside the flour. Most people don't think of flour as having sugar in it, but of course flour is made from the seeds of different types of grass. In this case it's wheat flour from the wheat plant, and the seed has to have enough energy, which it has in the form of sugar, in order to help a plant grow out of it. And so flour and seeds are full of sugar, what we call carbohydrates. That's why we say that bread is a carb. So what we're going to do now is rest our bread in a warm, still place. We're going to cover it with a cloth so it doesn't get dirty. And we're just going to let the yeast eat and release their gas. As they eat the sugar, they're going to release some other things from the grains that make the bread more nutritious for us. As I said, the air gets trapped in the gluten. So to do this, I'm going to put a little oil in a bowl. I take the first bit of that oil and actually put it onto the dough, and I just start smoothing it around the top and the sides. I then use my hand just to make sure the whole bowl is covered. Now this might seem a big bowl for flour of this size, but actually if we leave this for long enough, it will actually grow outside of the bowl and start flowing over the sides. So we do want to oil the whole bowl. Problem is, if it gets that big, the bread becomes really weak, which we don't want. So I'm going to now get both of my hands nice and oily, and I'm going to start working some of that oil around the outside. And just like earlier with my flat hands, I'm going to use cupping a little bit to get some oil around, but generally flat hands to stretch that gluten. And it goes. There we go. Okay, so here is my dough. My dough is ready to ferment. I will know it's fermented when it has roughly doubled in size. It'll be half as dense, so it will be fluffy. And if I was to poke my finger into it, my finger would disappear. But I wouldn't want to do that because I'll end up breaking some of that gluten I've worked so hard to make. So I'm going to pop this aside now. Let me get out my cloth. There we go, just a tea towel. If it's a cold day, or if there's really strong sunlight, or if you're using sourdough and you're going to leave it to proof for ages, you would wet the cloth first in order to keep the dough nice and moist. But in this case, it's not too hot, and it's not going to be proving for too long, so we're okay to leave it. Okay, that's it. Step one done. We'll come back in about an hour or an hour and a half. Keep checking. You can keep looking. Nothing happens too quickly though, so don't rush it. Okay, so it's been about 2.5 hours, which is a lot longer than normal, but it is quite a cool day. And I actually left it in the kitchen, whereas often I'll put it in a sunny spot near a window or something like that. But what we should find when we unveil this is that it has more or less doubled in size. Maybe not quite as big as I might have wanted, but not too bad. You'll see it's all bubbly on the inside where the yeast have been doing their thing. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of flour, scatter it out on the countertop. I don't want too much flour at this point, otherwise my bread's not going to fold well when I make it into a loaf. I'm now going to shake this out. Just watch out if your bowl is breakable. There we go. Pop that aside. I'm going to get a little bit of flour in my hands. And now I'm just going to scatter that, dust it over. Excellent. I can push down gently on this. I don't want to squeeze out, well, I don't want to break the air pockets that I've been busy making with the yeast, but I do want to flatten it out just in order that it's better to handle. I can flop it over. And what you'll see is it has a nice soft texture, it's stretchy, and I can work with it. All right. I'm going to do a type of loaf here called a stubby cylinder. It takes a little bit of thinking about, but you should be able to do this too. I'm going to take this leading edge, I'm going to fold it over, and I'm going to use the inside of my thumbs just here, this fleshy bit, to push it down. I'm going to do that again and again. And this is where you don't want too much flour, otherwise it won't stick and you'll end up with curly holes inside your loaf later on. And again. And keep going. Tuck, tuck, tuck. And when we get to the end, we can just push down the seal with our fingers. Now we've got something that looks like a baguette, and you could think, oh, I'll just bake that as it is, but actually got a few more steps. What you'll notice here, this lovely air bubble, that is an example of what gluten is capable of. So what I'm going to do now is stretch this out. I can roll it out. I can kind of treat it like a big sausagey pizza dough spaghetti type thing, like a noodle. And I want it to be about 3 times as long as my loaf is going to be. And now I want to flatten that down. Again, I'm trying not to destroy the structure of the bread. I'm just trying to squeeze some of the air out so that it can fill up again. And I'm now going to fold it into thirds like that. I'm going to push down. You'll notice it's not sticking to the surface. It's not sticking to my hand. If it is, you might want to use more flour at this point. Right, I'm now going to roll it in. Tuck with my thumbs again. Roll it again, tuck, roll and tuck. And now I can make this seam. This is going to be the bottom of the bread. I can fold the ends in to make them nice and neat. Otherwise you get a little hole at the bottom. And there it is, there's my loaf. You can see I've got this lovely line across the top here. All right, just before this goes onto the pan, I'm going to flour it. Rub the flour down a little bit and do the bottom. This will help it to not stick on the pan, which will be oiled, but still. There we go. Okay, great. So slide that to one side. Put our oil there, put our flour there. I'm just going to use a baking sheet for this. You can do these in a pan if you like, and there's all sorts of proving tools and different ways to do this, but for a basic loaf, a nice flat tin, a nice flat pan like this. You can also do this on a stone. You can heat up a stone and then shovel it onto the stone. Those are some more advanced techniques. Just going to oil that down. Nice coverage, nice and even. And then I'm going to pick up my dough. You can squash it in a little bit. I'm going to pop it down like that. All right. Now, I can leave this for to prove. It proves that the yeast is still alive by growing before it goes into the oven. I could leave it to prove for a while, then I could top it with different things, and then it could go into the oven. Actually, today I'm going to top it now just to show you how it's done, and then it will prove for a bit and go into the oven a little bit later. So the first thing I'm going to do is spray a little bit of water on. You get a nicer crust if your bread is a little bit damp. All right, so a few squirts of that. I'm now going to put some more flour on. This is going to absorb some of the water, but that's okay. In fact, with this, I'm just going to rub it on gently. I'm going to do that a couple times just to try and get a nice coverage of flour on the top. Also around the sides. Okay, you'll see some flour falling down on the pan. That's fine. All right. Some people like their bread really floury, others less so. Go for sort of medium flour. The water is helping the flour to stick. The flour will give it a nice look when it's done. Look like a nice rustic loaf. I could also, on top of the water, I could have put sesame seeds, different kind of seeds like that. All right, and then finally, because the dough is going to expand in the oven, those air pockets that are in there now that are relatively empty will fill up in the proving, and then as the oven heats up, you get something called oven lift. The whole bread lifts up and expands. Because of that, if we take it out of the oven, the crust will sag and crack and the loaf will be a little bit less attractive. So what we often do is slash the top of the bread in order to let the crust expand, and then it sets nicely. There's all sorts of different ways you can cut it. I like the traditional just 3 diagonal lines. I'm not cutting really deep. I'm not pushing down and squashing the loaf. I'm just using, and this is a very sharp knife, I'm just using the sharpness of the knife draw back and forward a couple of times. There we go. So this is going to prove, again, because it's a cold day, this is probably going to prove for about an hour, and then it will go into the oven. The oven will be set at 250 degrees, that's the maximum for most domestic ovens. We'll put some water in the bottom of the oven in a tray in order to help it hydrate, to steam the oven. That gives us a crust as well. And I think we'll probably try and record a time lapse of it in the oven, so hopefully you can see the process whereby initially it shrinks down from the shock of the heat, and then as the heat saturates into the bread and the bread warms up, it puffs up and it slowly goes golden brown. You could cook a loaf like this for 25 to 30 minutes. As I said, we start with the oven at 250, and then after 5 or 10 minutes you bring it down to 200, and that should be your cooking temperature. You want the loaf to be really golden brown, like crispy golden brown when it comes out. So here we go. This loaf of bread that we made earlier is now baked. It's had its 30 minutes in the oven. First 10 minutes at 250 degrees and then the remainder at 210 degrees. It's come out steaming hot. It's cooled down a little bit now. You can hear it's got a nice firm crust to it. It's still warm. A good test to see if it's cooked is whether the bottom, when it comes out, makes a hollow noise when you hit it. And as I mentioned earlier, you definitely don't want to cut this open too early, otherwise it's not going to cook through. I'm going to give this another 10 or 15 minutes to cool down, and then we're going to cut it open, get some butter out, and see how it tastes.